what extent can the Parliament use its powers to make amendments to the Constitution under Article 368? Landlords, it had the zamindars. That is the reason wherever Zamindari abolition acts bills were brought in, it was not allowed to be passed. Right? So the farmers, they are scared. They have this resistance. They have this reluctance. They feel, what if I invest my money? I bring in irrigation systems. I do fencing around the entire field. I do teak plantations. And finally, after 15th year, my zamindar comes and asks me to vacate the land. All my investments are gone. I am not going to take that risk. Unless land is owned by me, unless I have a security of tenure, security of ownership over my land, I am not ready to make any of these investments. Land reforms and zamindari abolition was a promise that was not fulfilled by the Congress. And why was it not fulfilled? Now, let us get into predominantly a topic of mains relevance. Okay, so first half we are seeing more of prelims relevance. Now let us have a look at a topic which has a lot of relevance in mains. Okay, and very interesting questions have been asked in this topic in the previous years. We will take up those questions at the end of the discussion, where we will try to brainstorm and you can even try to write answer. Because those kind of questions asked in the exam, I would say, to fill in the points, it's not only these information that is sufficient. The skill of extending an idea and building a narrative for 2.5-3 pages, that skill is what gets tested. Okay, so I need to actually see how you manage to fill in content, and I'll get to know that when I see your answers. But before that, let me give you an overview about this particular topic, so that even when you have some minor concerns or confusions, lack of clarity, let it get addressed first. Okay, so this is a topic which actually brings out how the judiciary over years has filled in a vacuum left behind by our constitution makers. Okay, a very essential filling work was done by judiciary to safeguard the constitution itself from being destroyed over time. And it was a hard struggle for judiciary. Okay, so it was a constant struggle between judiciary and parliament. Parliament keeps on increasing its powers. Judiciary steps in to trim down the powers of parliament. Right? So we need to actually understand about how this struggle unfolded itself. Okay, the struggle was all about the question of, to what extent can parliament amend the constitution under article 368? Okay, to what extent can the parliament use its powers to make amendments to the constitution under article 368? Okay, so first let us understand about the inherent conflict in the constitution itself. Our constitution was made from 1946 till 1950, right? So it was a period of framing of the constitution. By the time the constitution was framed, so many conflicts inherent in it has now come to the surface. That is why there was a need to resolve this conflict. How? By resorting to amending some problematic provisions. That's why the very first Constitutional Amendment Act was brought in the very immediate year after the commencement of the Constitution. In the year 1952, sorry, not 51, 52, 51. Okay. The first Constitutional Amendment Act was brought in. I'll ask you a question. The first Constitutional Amendment Act was enacted by following the procedure given under Article 368. Is it a correct statement or incorrect statement? The first Amendment Act was enacted by following the procedure given under Article 368. Is it correct? Or okay, at least tell me first which articles were all amended from your previous learning of polity. No, tell me which all articles were amended, or tell me broad provisions where on what all aspects of the constitution did this amendment have its impact on. Tell me those broad features, broad provisions, broad impacts. Okay, ninth schedule and fundamental rights. Okay, then what else? Yeah, fundamental rights. So many fundamental rights were impacted. Okay, Article 31A was inserted. Exemptions and fundamental rights. We had changes to Article 15, Article 19. Right? These are all some changes that were brought in. Right? But I wanted to understand the procedure under Article 368 was not followed. You're not using your logic. For Article 368 amendment, don't you need Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha? Yes or no? Do you need Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha? Yes, for an amendment to be brought out under the procedure given in Article 368. Can you please answer? Yes. Okay. Do you know the year when, for the first time, Rajya Sabha was even constituted? Rajya Sabha can only be constituted after state legislative assemblies are all constituted. And do you know when was the election to form the state legislative assemblies conducted? It was conducted in the winter of 1951 to 52. So it is only after 52 April, March, something like that. After that, only state legislative assemblies even came into existence. Only after state legislative assemblies come into existence, you can even have members sent to Rajya Sabha, which means 1952. Before that, no amendment could have been passed under Article 368. Correct? Which means the First Amendment Act was not followed using Article 368. Why? Because the Constitution clearly says it is the Constituent Assembly itself which will act as a provisional parliament until a parliament under the Constitution is constituted. Which means just a Constituent Assembly was the provisional parliament. It was a Constituent Assembly, that single house, which was actually making amendments. All this big amendment was carried out by the by the Constituent Assembly only, which continued to perform as a provisional parliament. Right? So use these kind of thoughts, use these logic, and then arrive at an answer. So First Amendment Act was passed in 1951 to resolve a lot of conflicts inherent in the Constitution. Right? What is that conflict? What is the conflict? Conflict between Part 3 and Part 4 of the Constitution. Do you understand what I said now about the provisional parliament, all of that? Yes. Okay. So you should understand that you see, first of all, not all parts of the Constitution came into effect in 1950. In 1949, November itself, some parts were given immediate effect. Certain other parts came into effect from 26 Jan 1950. Okay, but still, Rajya Sabha was not even existing. It had to be slowly formed. Until that time, India had to be run. Who was going to make laws? Somebody should be there to make laws. And that body was what was called as provisional parliament. Just like how you get your provisional certificate in your college. It is a provisional parliament which ran from 1950, 26 January 1950 till 1952, when the election results were all declared and the first government was formed, the first Lok Sabha was formed. So for about 1.5 2 years, it was the provisional parliament which also functioned as the constituent assembly. It was a constituent assembly which functioned as a provisional parliament. Provisional parliament made amendments, First Amendment Act of 1951. Okay. So, what is this conflict between part 3 and part 4 of the constitution? Part 3 gives importance to an individual, part 4 gives importance to the larger collective. Okay. If you want to improve the condition of the collective, it affects an individual. Too much concern for an individual will make the government blind to the needs of the collective. Right? So, the constitution makers did try their best to come up with the most functional constitution, but still there were some conflicts which, without resolution, cannot allow the country to progress forward. Okay, and moreover, Indian National Congress, after framing the constitution in 1950, it awakens itself to the reality that it has to face parliamentary elections in 1951 to 52, and it has to win this election. If it has to win the election, it has to now fulfill its promises given in its manifesto in 1936 elections. Do you remember the Congress elections of 1936? Right? Congress gave a lot of tall promises, but it was not able to fulfill all its promises. Okay, tell me, what were the promises that were unfilled that it gave in the Congress manifesto of the 1936 elections? Some unfulfilled promises. The first among them, what would that be? Right? So, land reforms and zamindari abolition was a promise that was not fulfilled by the Congress. And why was it not fulfilled? Tell me, in 1936 elections, right? After Congress party won elections, in most of the provinces, Congress governments were formed. So, the Congress government ruled from 1937 till 1939. The declaration of the Second World War brought an end to these Congress governments. Why were the Congress governments not able to fulfill their promises given in the manifesto? Why were they not able to carry out these reforms? No, they were not reserved subjects. No. See, in the provinces, there is no concept called as reserved subjects. In the provinces, from the Government of India Act 1935, all the subjects have become transferred subjects. And land is a transferred subject. Yeah, correct. Checked by the second chamber. That's correct. That is why the Britishers in the Government of India Act 1935, since they know that they are going to give provincial autonomy for the different provinces, they want to bring in a check and balance mechanism. What is a check and balance mechanism? They brought in bicameralism in the provinces. Bicameralism was introduced in the provinces for the first time in 1935. So they had the second chamber, and the second chamber had landlords, it had the zamindars. That is the reason wherever zamindari abolition acts bills were brought in, it was not allowed to be passed. So it was an unfulfilled promise of Congress. So people are all waiting for India to become independent. And now that India has become independent, Congress has to fulfill its promise. Right? And why was this very, very important in the post-independence India? What was the necessity to abolish zamindari system and to carry out speedily land reforms? What was the reason for that? 90% of Indian population, when we got independence in 1950, they were into agriculture. So if you want to uplift the life of 90% of the Indian population, you will have to bring in reforms in the agricultural sector. You have to induce those farmers to practice agriculture in a modern basis, which means you have to incentivize the farmers to make investments on land. They have to bring in better irrigation facilities. You have to bring in Better seeds, high yielding varieties of seeds need to be used. Better pest management has to be brought in. And long value crops, high value crops, long maturity crops should all be sowed. Right? Imagine you have 1 acre, you cultivate this 1 acre, you grow rice all the time. What is the maximum profit you get in 1 acre in a year? Not more than 1 lakh rupees. But for that same 1 acre, if you cultivate teak, teakwood or sandal or red sanders, right? You were to take up the cultivation of these crops. The first 15 years, you will not get any returns. You'll only have to keep on investing. But in the 15th year onwards, the total returns you will get from the same 1 acre will be 1 crore rupees. You see, this is the power of making all these kind of modern investments in land. But the problem is in 1950, the farmers who were cultivating on these lands, they were not ready to make this investment. They were not ready to shift their cultivating pattern, cropping pattern. Okay, they are not ready to make any investments. Tell me, what is the reason for that? If you want to increase the livelihood, lifestyle, life standard of Indians, you have to focus on agriculture. But agriculture had its systemic issues. The farmers are not going, they are not willing to make all these investments. They are not going to take up this risk. You know why? It's because all these lands on which the farmers worked, the lands did not belong to the individual farmers. The individual farmers were all tenants, right? They were just occupants who can be evicted at any time, evicted at the will of the zamindar or the landlord, right? So the farmers, they are scared, they have this resistance, they have this reluctance. They feel, what if I invest my money, I bring in irrigation systems, I do fencing around the entire field, I do teak plantations, and finally after 15th year my zamindar comes and asks me to vacate the land, all my investments are gone. I am not going to take that risk. Unless land is owned by me, unless I have a security of tenure, security of ownership over my land, I am not ready to make any of these investments. Right? So, if India cannot develop, India can only progress forward if all these investments are made. Government itself cannot come and make investments on all people's land. People only have to make these investments, but for that they demand ownership. And for ownership, the land history has produced an India where 95% of the land was concentrated in the hands of 5% of people, the zamindars. Okay, and it's these zamindars who now have a constitutional protection. There was an article under Article 19 of the Constitution, right? Under Article 19, you have various freedoms today. There was one particular freedom which talk about freedom of property, freedom to own property, right of property was one of the freedoms under Article 19. Okay, the fundamental right of ownership of property protects an individual. But then we have a directive principle of state policy under Article 39. Okay, a directive principle which provides for redistribution, of assets so that no concentration of wealth happens. You see, both of these are opposed in each other in principle, opposed to each other in principle. Okay, so making use of these directive principles given in Constitution, various state governments, okay, across India, the state governments, they started making use of DPSP to make laws. Okay, we had the Madras Tenancy Act. We had the Zamindari Abolition Act of Odisha government. Because of course, Zamindari system was not there in Madras. So it was Tenancy Reforms Act of Madras, Zamindari Abolition in Odisha, right? Various state governments, they all came up with their own legislations. And what was the goal of all the legislation? It is to abolish zamindari, to redistribute surplus lands to landless farmers. This was the whole objective. So as soon as the state governments came up with their laws, you know, the most affected sections, the zamindari section, they all went and challenged the validity of these laws in their respective high courts. Constitution came into effect in 1950, 26th Jan. As soon as constitution came into effect, now you have the fundamental right of freedom of ownership of property under Article 19. So the different high courts in all the states they were just bombarded with cases, litigations by all these zamindari class of people. Okay. Now high courts have no other option than to declare all these state laws as invalid. Why? Because it is contravening the fundamental right under Article 19. High courts have no other option than to declare these laws as invalid. And that is where Parliament steps in. Parliament steps in so as to come out with a Constitutional Amendment Act.